I'd like to start by giving you one story about Sally, the lady that Jane mentioned. She was on our farm for 55 years, and she led a fairly controlled life in that she couldn't so much as use the TV remote because her husband wouldn't allow it. She didn't drive. She just stayed on the farm. But Sally was involved in a fairly serious accident, and she was in the hospital. And after a few days, the physician came in. He says, "You're really improving. You're looking great." Said, "In a couple of weeks, you'll be able to drive." And Sally says, "That's wonderful. I haven't been able to drive for 75 years. In my not always so humble opinion, I think that Max Ehrmann gave the world an incredible gift when in 1927 he published his Desiderata. Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others, even to the dull and ignorant. They too have their stories. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain or bitter, for always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. Keep interested in your own career, however humble. It is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time. Exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery. But let this not blind you to what virtue there is. Many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. Be yourself. Especially do not feign affection. Neither be cynical about love, for in the face of all aridity and disenchantment, it is as perennial as the grass. Take kindly the counsel of years, gracefully surrendering the things of your youth. Nurture strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune. But do not distress yourself with dark imaginings. Many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness. Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt, the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive him to be. And whatever your labors and aspirations in the noisy confusion of life, keep peace in your soul. With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Be cheerful. Strive to be happy. Max Ehrman, 1927. I didn't do that. There's one line in that poem that I keep going back to, and that is, beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. And that got me to thinking about concern for the self. My topic today is a fierce and tender concern for the self. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was a physician, said, "The best way to ensure a long and productive life is to have a chronic disease and take care of it." When I first read that, I was young and invulnerable. I was going to live forever. And it wasn't until I was much older and I was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness that I began to understand his words. You might ask, what changed? Well, I think the answer to that question is simply that I became aware of time. Once a person becomes aware of time, they become aware of their own mortality. That single realization alone can cause a person to develop a fierce and tender concern for the self. Concern for the self at some level indicates self-love. When a person can finally fall in love with their self, it's the beginning of a romance with all of humanity. There is, however, a profound difference between self-love and self-absorption. How do we learn to express caritas, or love for all, without either becoming self-depreciating or egocentric? Perhaps the answer lies in the words of Shakespeare, "Above all, to thine own self be true." One thing that has always interested me about religion is this idea of how we approach self-love or caritas. And there are some distinct differences between the Occidental and the Oriental approach to religious philosophies. And I think it's helpful to look at those differences. There are fundamental differences in these two philosophical approaches to life and one's relationship to the eternal. I think the first thing that struck me as a young person was the fact that in the Western view of religion, we seem to be able to separate our philosophy of life from our philosophy of religion. You know, it's like we can parcel it out. I don't believe in this, but yet over here I'm doing things that are really contradictory to another belief. The first major difference of the two philosophical approaches is in the Eastern view, one is asked to rid themselves of their ego, whereas in Western thought, one was asked to tune and train the ego. The idea there was, the older philosophy is that when we were at the end of our time, if we had been training our ego, we would hand that ego back to God in its best possible shape. The early Western monks saw the ego as a sense of self, as opposed to the idea of egocentrism. And Western thought it was more important what you do rather than what you felt. Eastern thought was just the reverse. It was more important what you felt than what you do. There are some interesting teaching stories from both perspectives that we should take a look at. First, from the Western view, St. John of the Cross said, if you were in an ecstasy as deep as St. Paul, and a sick man needed a cup of soup, it is better for you to return from the ecstasy for love's sake and bring him a cup of soup. Ignatius of Loyola, the hermit priest in the 1500s, put it this way: how much more in God's sight is one act of charity performed by the will than all the visions of ecstasy one might receive from heaven. There's a wonderful teaching story from the medieval period. It seems that there was a monk in a European monastery, and more than anything else on earth, he wanted to see a vision of the Virgin Mary while he was meditating. By the way, in Buddhist religion, it was considered to be enlightened if you would see a vision of the Buddha with a light behind his head. But in early Western religion, to see a vision of the Virgin Mary could have been considered idolatry. Anyway, the teaching story goes like this. This monk spent his entire life meditating, wanting to see a vision of the Virgin Mary. One day when he was elderly, the vision appeared. However, just as it appeared, the bell rang at the back door of the monastery. It was his job to go to the back door and feed the poor, to hand out loaves of bread. He was in turmoil, but he had to do his job. So he apologized to the vision, and he ran off to the back door to feed the poor. After he had accomplished his job, he returned to his meditation pillow, and he sat down. He once again apologized profusely to the vision, but the vision stopped him. The vision said, if thou hadst stayed, I must have fled. Eastern thought does not reject the idea of loving care, but Eastern thought focuses more on that internal, that self-search. The view is that we are all a part of the whole, but we must find our own personal way to reach and interact with that whole. This is done through thought, through prayer, and through meditation. Notice how the Bhagavad Gita is similar to Rudyard Kipling's poem, If. Kipling says in his poem, If, triumph and disaster, treat those two impostors just the same. The Bhagavad Gita says, one to me is shame or fame. One to me is joy or pain. One to me is loss or gain. Both proclaim that most of us buy into life's illusions rather than focusing on the essence of life. In Eastern thought, the quest is really important. And the quest for recognition, the quest for power, the quest for money is all false. There are distractions from life, distractions from having unity with the eternal. They view materialism as a myth, and chasing power is like chasing God. Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao in the 4th century before Jesus, saw the universe as a whole, the one. And so there was always that search for oneness. Whether you endorse Eastern or Western view or some combination of the two, there are some common ground. They both promote the tuning and training of the self, the mind, and the ego. They both promote turning away from the trappings of society, such as materialism, competition, and violence. I think it's easy for us to get trapped in the mind's whirlwinds, trying to decide what to do, trying to decide what to choose, what goal to chase. But in the end, if we are to be healthy, we must choose to protect, love, and care for the self and for others. Plato talked about the human mind as being like a mutiny at sea. Sometimes the mind is just whirling, but the captain must ultimately gain control and guide the ship. The Roman mystic Plotinus compared the mind to a choir before the choir director arrives. Ultimately, it is our mind, and we must take charge. We must be in control through both the good times as well as the turbulent times. And again, the Bard of Avon cautions us, above all, to thine own self be true. There's a great story about Rabbi Zusha. He was an 18th century Hasidic rabbi, and he emphasized the importance of being true to yourself. Rabbi Zusha was once asked by his congregation to take a particular stand on a political issue. And he refused to take a stand because it violated his own personal conscience. And when he refused, his congregation got very angry. And they said, Rabbi Zusha, if Moses were here, Moses would do it. He thought for a minute, then he said, when I stand before God, he will not say to me, Zusha, why were you not Moses? He will say, Zusha, why were you not Zusha? He exhibited a fierce and tender concern for himself. Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist and mystic, wrote, there are over 600,000 letters in the Torah. They each symbolize the 600,000 life's paths that are there for human beings. The message here is that we must each find our own path and be true to ourselves and fiercely protect and care for ourselves. We must each find our own song, our own dance, our own rhythm, our own bliss. But the operative word is our own. So you must find your own. St. Thomas Aquinas saw a relationship with the self and the eternal in this way. And he said, anything that you do that is good for your own individuality is also good for your relationship with God. I'm sure many of you have heard the medieval story of the juggler of Notre Dame. But if you haven't, and even if you have, it goes like this. There was an itinerant juggler named Barnaby who became a monk. And during the time of King Louis of France, it was customary to present the statue of the Virgin Mary with a gift during the festival of Notre Dame. Barnaby had nothing but his juggling. So late one night, after everyone was gone, Barnaby snuck in and juggled for the statue. He was immediately arrested and accused of blasphemy, which is a crime punishable by death. As he was being taken away, the statue stepped down off of her pedestal and said to his accusers, "He gave me his all. Did you?" Giving is critical to life. However, giving, we must receive as well. The essence of giving is giving of yourself. Far too often we want things given to us without significant work on our part. We are evolving beings, and evolution takes work. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who I suppose I would have to say is financially naive and a bit on the lazy side. And so I worked with him for a long time. And finally, I purchased for him this whole set of books and cassettes and things like that on becoming financially independent. It wasn't cheap, but it was for a friend, and I gave it to him. And when I did, he looked at it and he said, "I'm too busy to listen to all those tapes or read that book." He said, "Why don't you just tell me real quickly what I have to do?" Well, I'd been telling him for years what he needed to do. So anyway, in my opinion, this shows very little concern for self. Human beings seldom make great transcendental changes in their life. Most of our changes involve a slow evolution. We seem to want everything now, whatever it is. We want enlightenment to come through lightning bolts, and it doesn't. We are certainly unlike the early monks who spent their entire life in training. These medieval monks often call themselves the athletes of God. We all run into people every day who go from Zen to yoga to meditation to jazzercise to jogging, sometimes with absolutely no interest in how this will help me expand my own abilities to grow and evolve. These people are like groupies of the latest fad. The mystic teacher Gurdjieff said, and I quote, "It is impossible to give a man anything that would be his inalienable property without work on his part." Another quote that I'm very fond of comes from the great meditation teacher Sri Chinmoy. And he said, "Most people will do anything for their own advancement except work for it." A fierce and tender concern for the self primarily involves love. And in my opinion, love is the necessary and sufficient soul food for life. I'm not fond of Levitican law, so I have to really cherry pick to find something I agree with. The famous Levitican quote, "Love others as thyself." Well, it does not say better than thyself, but as thyself. I think it also means that love thyself as you love others. St. John of the Cross, the writer and Spanish mystic, wrote, and I quote, "In the evening of your life, you shall be judged by love," close quote. A couple of years before he died, Sigmund Freud was talking with one of his disciples, J.C. Flegel. And at some point in the conversation, Flegel asked, "We've been together for some time. Answer me this question. How does psychoanalysis cure the patient?" Freud thought for a moment, and in a very un-Freudian answer, he said, "At one point in the analytic process, the analyst loves the patient, and the patient knows it, and the patient is cured," close quote. What does it mean to love another person? I think it has something to do with allowing that person to be exactly who they are. And so to love thyself would naturally be to let you be who you are. The psychic healer Agnes Samford wrote, "It is only love that can generate the healing fire." If she is correct, and I think she is, I think it's highly possible that a fierce and tender concern for the self will potentiate our own healing. Our own healing is potentiated in that instant of self-love. Now, before all this talk about self-love begins to sound like artificial sweetener, I want to remind you of what St. Teresa of Avila said. And she said, I quote, "Oh God, save us from sober and serious saints," close quote. The Sufi mystic Pierre Vilar-Khan said, "Judge your gurus by how much fun they have in their life." I think we not only have to have a fierce and concern for self, but we also have to have a healthy dose of laughter. I will leave you with 3 of my permanent lifelong rules. Number 1, don't take yourself too seriously. Number 2, don't take yourself too seriously. And number 3, don't take yourself too seriously. Thank you.